The red door.
She wakes up with a gasp, lying on the floor too scared to get up. Her hands scrape against the rough floor beneath her, while her eyes lay fixed at the ceiling dotted with black and grey patches. A few meters above her head is a square window. Through it a grey light washes in. Slowly, with the help of her elbows, she rose. Looking around, she couldn't tell where she was. She couldn't remember who she was or even how she got here. It was cold here. Steam rose out of her mouth every time she took a breath. She was now sitting with her back against the wall, her chin tucked deep into her knees as she folded her arms around her legs, shivering. The room she was in was long and rectangular, its walls covered with wallpaper that looked old and yellow, peeling away into decadence. Her heart was racing now and her head throbbed as memory after memory came hurtling into her mind as she was reminded of who she was, where she was, and why she was here. She was in an accident, a car accident. She had hit her head over something hard, and when she woke up, she was here. She let out a cold breath as the reality of her situation dawned on her. It was a dark dream, an endless hole, she knew, which seemed to go on forever. And once you think this torture and misery is your destiny from which there is no running, it ends abruptly, like a fall, which ends suddenly on the concrete with a great sickening crunch and a lot of pain. Suddenly, everything looked horrifyingly familiar. The window overhead, the pale peeling walls, and the coarse floor, and in front of her, the red door. Her wide black eyes were staring deep into its red paint. She had been here before, but that was a long time ago, when she was just a child. Where everything in this room was old and falling apart, the door was all shining, its mahogany wood glistening in the grey light. She did not want to go through it, but she knew the door was her only escape. Death was her only escape. She rose up slowly. She noticed that she was wearing a skirt that went just below her groin, covering half her thigh. It was uncomfortably tight, and its faded pink cloth clutched her in its embrace. The pink dress was pretty. Her father had brought it for her. Her father loved her. He had kind eyes and a smiling face. He was looking at her now, his head cocked to one side. He smiled. But that was 20 years ago. As she walked towards the door, she looked behind her. Through that tiny window, she could see that it was snowing. Huge gusts of wind were howling its way through the thickly falling snows. Now she remembers it was snowing that day, the day of her accident. She touched the doorknob. Its shiny bronze surface felt oddly warm to her, as if somebody was holding it before she touched it. Slowly, she rotated it, heard the clicking sound as a small crack opened. As she peeked out, her heart suddenly started to thud loudly in her chest, and her mouth went dry. She quickly looked back as thick, cold beads of sweat gleamed on her forehead. It was still snowing outside the window. Her heart still throbbing in her chest, she pulled the door open with all her might. It opened like a mouth, gaping like a grotesque monstrosity, letting in a huge warm gust of wind. An endless desert, parched and dry, greeted her. She could not believe her eyes. She looked back again. The same sight greeted her. Depressed, she walked forward, immersing her cold bare feet into the warm sand. The sun above was shining hot and hard. She walked a few feet and came out of the building. She turned to look at it. What made her go mad in her senses was not its old crumbling walls or its abnormally crooked structure that leaned to one side, but the walls that flanked it on both sides. The old crumbling building lay sandwiched between the two as they raced along on both sides, out of sight and comprehension. She felt herself go dizzy as she looked above her. The walls were as high as the clouds, and the empty space between the two, where the little building perched, looked like a huge grey gash. Through it she could still see the dead grey sky and snow endlessly falling. The walls seemed to her like a barrier between the two worlds, a dark dream, an endless hole, she thought.
Well, well, well. What do we have here, dear sweet Nia, come to pay us a visit?
The blood-curdling voice said. She knew that voice from somewhere. Before her heart was racing, but now it just sank, hardly beating. She looked around, slowly rotating her head. The village shaman was shouting her name in his hoarse voice, rhythmic in its tone but haunting in its essence. Her ears were humming with that voice. Niyama, Niyama, Niyama. It went. The memory had faded a bit, but the rhythmic flow of the words still inhabited a dark part of her mind, and the memory refused to go away. A black girl, small and wretched, walks in. Her parents flanking her, holding her hands, they looked at the old shaman and then at her fleetingly. She's scared as always. She was born on the full moon, and that was her curse. Her eyes met his. The gleaming red-hot eyes, half hidden behind a high collar, were looking at her. His barrel of a chest stood over abnormally long and gaunt legs, black as a shadow cloak hanging carelessly over his broad shoulders. Stella fell to her knees as an utter despondency overtook her. She had forgotten all about him. Somewhere inside her, a voice cried to her, begging her to run. But she knew that that would be useless. This was his world. There was no running from him here. Shawl. She was surprised that she still remembered the name. Gil, she whispered. Please forgive me. That was all she could say before the cloaked being whooshed in, grabbed her by her black hair, and flew toward the middle of the desert. She was grabbing her hair, desperately trying to wrench free. He threw her on the soft sand, while he himself sat hovering in front of her a few feet above the ground. A wad of white papers magically appeared in his hand.
So let's see.
He pursed his lips as he shuffled the white bundle of papers in his hand.
Niama O'Dumbar, currently known as Stella White, right?
He muttered to himself.
Born in a useless old village in West Africa, right.
He went on.
Fled the village while her uncle, at a tender age of 16, came to America, the land of the free and the brave, blah blah, boring.
He flung the papers over his shoulders and looked over at Stella with a cold gaze that sent a chill up her spine.
Now let's come to the real issue, shall we? How many souls?
He boomed in Stella's direction. Stella felt herself knocked backward by the force of the voice. She knew that this question was coming. A long time ago he had asked her the same question. A small mouth gaping and a vacant expression clung to her face. The little girl sits in front of her and the shaman motions towards Niama to come forward. Meekly she moves while the shaman continues to eye her. Holding her in his gaze, smoke fills the room as the shaman flings some black grain-like substance into the fire, burning ominously in a small pot. Her eyes begin to water due to the strong smell of the smoke. The shaman clutches her hair from behind, forcing her to bend forward, his voice full of anger and malice. "Breathe," he says. She takes in a long breath unwillingly. The acrid smoke fills her nose and throat. Hot tears running down her cheeks mixed with the water oozing from her nose. For a moment all she could hear is her coughing and ragged breathing, and then the rhythmic tune. Niama, Niama, Niama. All she could do was cry, and she said in a squeaking sound, "I don't know, please."
Wrong answer!
He shouted while waving his long, ugly finger at her. "Please, it was the village shaman. He made me do it. It was he." He cut her midway before she could complete.
Oh yeah, the old shaman, I remember him. Tasted exquisite, by the way, very little on the bone, but the meat was tender.
She looked warily at him.
What, you don't believe me?
His eyes, his blazing red eyes, looked mischievously at her.
Now that was a real stake through the heart.
A real silver glinting stake formed itself out of nothing in his hands. He mimicked the stabbing by lodging it between his chest and arm, fell down making faint gurgling sounds. As he rose back again he was laughing heartily, bending double while slapping his thin bole of a thigh. The stake lay on the hot sand still glinting.
On a serious note, I did torture the hell out of him, and now...
He smiled the same grim smile and said,
It's your turn.
"Please, I have children."
It's always that, isn't it? Excuses, 20 years ago it was, I want my parents, and the endless crying. For your information, this time nothing will save you. The last time you had a little fever, dear Nia, saved by some herbal medicine. But this time you are in a coma. That means you are here forever.
He whispered the last word. He circled her, hovering just above ground, and then added ominously,
I have made sure of that.
She was with her parents. The winds were howling and the rains lashed their mud house. The tiny shack collapsed. All night she, her father, and her mother struggled against the elements to restore the hut, drenched to the bone, the floods rising. Finally they gave up. On the next morning she was ill. Fever had caught hold of her like a terrible snare. Unconscious, she moved between reality and dreams.
Please, do it. Kill me.
She tried to stand up, but the tight skirt made it difficult for her to move.
Didn't I tell you? There's no escape. Look around you. This is the hell.
At one moment she was looking at him, and in the other he was onto her. It happened so fast that she hardly registered what was happening. He caught her hair and began to pull in opposite directions until she felt her head is going to split in two. She was flailing her arms, grabbing at his cloak, scratching at the scaly black flesh of his face, clutching at his hands, desperately trying to free herself from his grip, but he was too strong for her. The shawl was moaning now almost with pleasure. His moans filled her ears as his sharp talons moved deeper and deeper into her skull.
I will die any time now.
She kept thinking to herself,
Like the last time, it will end quickly.
but the pain grew more and more as her blood filled the dry air in a spray. She wanted to fight him, but the pain was so overpowering that her whole body went limp. The pain moved like a worm, moving down from the top of her head toward her forehead, hot blood running down her face, the flesh ripping like a dry cloth, and then he let go of her. Still alive and breathing, she touched her forehead. No blood, nothing, only pain. For a moment, overwhelmed by searing pain cutting through her scalp like a deep gash, she just wanted to give up, but
What about my children?
What about them?
The salt sucker's whole progeny is cursed.
she looks up at him, probing, while the question gnaws at her from inside. Is the same fate awaiting my children, being tortured like this for eternity?
Yes.
He hissed, almost as if relishing the thought.
It was never my mistake, you know.
But they all say that.